The valley is littered with the dead, for kings came from the east with armies. 5 kings of the Jordan plain stood against them. The battle was brutal and short. Lot, Abraham and Apos, nephew, the man who chose the best land and moved towards Sodom, has been taken captive. His tent, his flocks, his family, gone. Abraham gets the news from a single survivor who runs all the way to find him. And here is what you have to understand about Abraham at this moment. He is not a soldier. He is a herdsman, a wanderer, a man of tents. He has 318 trained men, servants born in his household. That is his army. Against kings. Against 4 coalition forces who had just finished routing an alliance of 5. He goes anyway, and he wins. Genesis 14 does not linger on the miracle of it. It does not pause to let you process the odds. It simply moves. Abraham returns with Lot, with the captives, with the plunder, and he walks into a valley called Shave, the king and Apos' valley, where the king of Sodom is waiting to negotiate. And then, out of nowhere, another king appears. No introduction, no backstory, no end quote. And this is the man who was born to so-and-so, the son of so-and-so, end quote. He simply arrives, the way important things in Scripture sometimes arrive, without warning, without pedigree, without explanation. His name is Melchizedek. He is the king of a city called Shalem, and he is carrying bread and wine. He blesses Abraham. He blesses God. And Abraham, the man God called from Ur, the man who believed and it was counted as righteousness, the father of the Jewish people, the one to whom God said, through you all the nations of the earth will be blessed, bows, and pays him 1/10 of everything. 3 verses. That is all Genesis gives you. And then Melchizedek is gone. Here is why that matters. Genesis is the most genealogy-obsessed book in the Bible. It tracks who fathered whom across 10 generations before the flood and 10 generations after. Every major figure arrives with a family line attached. Abraham has one. Isaac will have one. Jacob will have one. The table of nations in Genesis 10 lists 70 families, 70, because the text wants you to know that everyone comes from somewhere. Melchizedek comes from nowhere. No father, no mother, no birth, no death, no record of his line. In a book that exists to trace origins, he is a carved-out gap. And that gap, as you will see, was not an accident. There is one more detail in Genesis 14 worth pausing on. When Melchizedek blesses Abraham, he does not use a Canaanite divine name. He does not invoke Baal or Asherah or any of the gods of the land. He speaks to El Elyon, which in Hebrew is El Elyon, God Most High, the maker of heaven and earth. And Abraham immediately uses the same name when he refuses the king of Sodom and Apos' offer. Same God, same name. A Canaanite priest king, in a city that will not be called Jerusalem for centuries, already knows the true God, before the law, before the covenant at Sinai, before Israel exists as a nation. Stay with me, because this detail is not peripheral. It is the first clue in a thread that runs all the way to the cross. Before we go further, we need to sit with his name, because in the ancient Near East, names were not decoration. They were declarations. A name was a compressed theology, a claim about the world, a statement about who a person was and what they carried. Melchizedek. In Hebrew, Melchizedek. 2 words pressed together. The first is Melech, king. The second is Tzedek, righteousness. So his name means, literally, my king is righteousness, or king of righteousness. And the city he rules? Shalem, peace, completeness. The city name that will one day be folded into Jerusalem, the city of peace. King of righteousness, ruler of peace. The writer of Hebrews will notice this 700 years after David and nearly 2,000 years after Genesis, and he will point it out as though it is the first and most obvious thing about the man. Righteousness first, then peace. That sequence is not accidental. You cannot have genuine peace, the deep, lasting, structural kind, without righteousness first. Every human attempt to build peace while skipping justice eventually collapses. History tells you this. Your own life probably tells you this. But here, in the names of a man whose biography is otherwise completely blank, God encoded an order. Righteousness, then peace. Now let us talk about the bread and the wine. Melchizedek comes to Abraham not with a political treaty, not with a demand for tribute, not with a negotiation. He comes with food. He comes with sustenance after the battle. Bread and wine, the same two elements that will appear on the night Jesus is betrayed, when he takes a loaf and a cup and tells his disciples that something cosmic is being transacted through the simplest things on the table. You might chalk that up to coincidence. But here is what Josephus writes in his Jewish Antiquities, around 93 AD, when he describes Melchizedek. He calls him a Canaanite chieftain of righteousness who was beloved of God, and who was the first person to build a sanctuary on the hill that would become Jerusalem, and the first to serve there as its priest. Josephus, writing for a Roman audience, still cannot get past Melchizedek. He is too strange, too important, too deliberately placed to skip. And then there are the Dead Sea Scrolls. In 1947, inside a cave at Qumran above the western shore of the Dead Sea, scholars found a fragment known as 11Q Melchizedek, written somewhere between 100 BC and 50 BC. It presents Melchizedek not as a historical footnote, but as a heavenly figure, a divine agent who will execute judgment and proclaim liberation in the last days. The Qumran community was using Melchizedek as a lens for the end of history. They had been thinking about him for centuries. They could not let him go. Here is what most people miss. The silence around Melchizedek in Genesis did not make ancient readers less interested in him. It made them more interested. The gap pulled them in. Because a figure without origin and without end, in a book where everything has an origin and an end, is either a mistake or a message. And the people closest to the text decided it was a message. Abraham seems to know this instinctively, because what he does next is staggering. He gives Melchizedek a tithe, a tenth, of everything he recovered from the battle. Not a gift, not a tax, a tithe, the offering that acknowledges someone and Apos, s authority over you, someone and Apos, s priestly standing before God on your behalf. In ancient culture, a tithe was not charity. It was an act of submission. It said, "You stand in a place I cannot stand. You have access I do not have. I am placing this in your hands because your hands reach higher than mine." Abraham, who had just refused the king of Sodom and Apos' offer of wealth because he would not let any earthly king claim credit for what God had done, turns to Melchizedek and gives him 10% of the plunder. No hesitation, no negotiation. What did Abraham know about this man that Genesis does not tell us? Genesis leaves that question unanswered. It will stay unanswered for approximately 1,000 years. And then David writes Psalm 110. You need to understand what Psalm 110 is, because it is not a gentle devotional. It is a royal coronation psalm, a song sung when a king of Israel took the throne in Jerusalem. And in the middle of this coronation ceremony, God speaks directly to the king being crowned and says something that should have stopped everyone in the room cold. You are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. Pause on that. A king of Israel being told he is also a priest. In a religious system, the one God gave Moses at Sinai, where kings and priests are completely separate offices, where the priesthood belongs exclusively to the tribe of Levi, where Uzziah, a king who tried to burn incense in the temple, was struck with leprosy on the spot and died a leper, where the line between king and priest is not a guideline, it is a wall, a law, a boundary enforced with death. And yet here is God, inside a coronation ceremony, telling a Davidic king, you are a priest, not of Aaron and Apos' order, not of Levi and Apos' line, of the order of Melchizedek. David is reaching back across a millennium to a figure who predates the law, predates the priesthood of Aaron, predates the tribe of Levi. And he is saying, the priesthood of this man, the unnamed, unborn, undead king of Salem, is the category into which the ultimate king will fit. Why? Why not simply say you are a priest of the order of Aaron? Why drag in a figure from Genesis 14 who appears for 3 verses and disappears? Because Aaron and Apos' priesthood had a problem. Several problems. And by the time Hebrews is written, probably late 1st century AD, probably to Jewish Christians in Rome who were being pressured to return to Temple Judaism, those problems have become urgent. The first problem, Aaron and Apos' priests died. Every single one of them. They came to the altar, they served for their years, and they passed the role to their sons. The priesthood was continuous, but no single priest was. Every priest who interceded for you eventually stopped interceding. He died and someone else took his place, and eventually that person died too. The chain never broke, but the links kept changing. And every time a link changed, there was a gap, a moment of transition, of uncertainty, of a priesthood in process rather than in place. Now watch what happens next. The second problem: bloodline. Jesus was from the tribe of Judah. Every Israelite knew this. Matthew and Apos' genealogy establishes it. Luke and Apos' genealogy establishes it. The tribe of Judah produced kings, not priests. The Levitical law was not a suggestion. You could not simply walk up to the altar if you were from Judah. You would be removed. The entire sacrificial system, every atonement offering, every day of atonement ritual, all of it was built on the assumption that the priest came from Levi through Aaron. If Jesus is the final, ultimate high priest, as Hebrews argues, then he has a bloodline problem. A serious one. One that should, by every rule in the system, disqualify him entirely. Unless the Levitical priesthood was never the final category. Unless there was an older order, a deeper order, that predated Aaron, predated Moses, predated the law itself. An order rooted not in bloodline, but in something else entirely. Pay attention to this, because this is where the whole argument turns. The writer of Hebrews is not a careless reader. He has spent chapters building a case. Jesus is greater than the angels, greater than Moses, greater than Joshua, greater than Aaron. And now he arrives at the chapter that handles the hardest question. If Jesus is our high priest, why was he not from Levi? How can a man from Judah stand at the altar of God? And the answer he gives is not a workaround. It is not an apology. It is a revelation. He goes back to Genesis 14. He quotes it, and then he says something that the Greek text makes almost impossibly precise. In Hebrews chapter 7, verse 3, describing Melchizedek, he uses a word that exists nowhere else in ancient Greek literature. Apertologidos. It means, without father recorded, without mother recorded, without genealogy recorded. No beginning of days entered in any register. No end of life written down. He is not saying Melchizedek had no parents. He is not making a claim about what Melchizedek was made of. He is making a literary and theological argument. In the text of Genesis, which is obsessive about genealogy, Melchizedek has no entry, no birth record, no death record, and that absence is the point. The text presents him, says Hebrews, as someone who remains a priest continually, not permanently in his own biology, permanently in the structure of the narrative. The story never ends his priesthood, and so in Scripture, he abides. This is the argument. Jesus does not become a priest by inheriting an office through the correct bloodline. He becomes a priest by the power of an indestructible life. Hebrews chapter 7, verse 16 uses exactly those words. According to the power of a life that cannot be dissolved. A life that cannot be dissolved. Not a priesthood passed down. Not an office inherited. A priesthood that belongs to him because he cannot die and stay dead. Because the grave had no mechanism for holding him. Because the life in him was of a category that decomposition cannot touch. Here is the part nobody tells you. Hebrews is not arguing that Jesus is Melchizedek. This is the misreading. This is where commentators occasionally slip and where readers get confused. Melchizedek is a type. Jesus is the fulfillment. A type and its fulfillment are always two different figures. The Passover lamb is not Jesus. The Passover lamb points to Jesus. The bronze serpent in the wilderness is not Jesus. The bronze serpent points to Jesus. And Melchizedek, this priest-king from Shalem with no recorded beginning and no recorded end, is not Jesus in disguise. He is a portrait God painted in a man and Apos' missing paperwork, centuries before the portrait and Apos' subject was born. The type is always lesser than the fulfillment. Always. The Passover lamb could not forgive sin. It could only cover it for a year. Melchizedek and Apos' priesthood, whatever it was limited to his lifespan, to his city, to the bread and wine he carried in that one valley on that one day. But the order he represented, the category his priesthood occupied, that category was eternal. And Jesus steps into it not by inheriting it, but by being the only one whose life was powerful enough to hold it permanently. And then Hebrews makes one more argument. The one about Abraham. Remember the tithe? Abraham gave Melchizedek 10% of everything. The writer of Hebrews points out that Levi, the ancestor of every Israelite priest, the man whose bloodline authorized the entire sacrificial system, was, at the moment Abraham paid that tithe, still unborn. He was inside Abraham, literally, biologically, inside his great-grandfather. And so, in a sense that is simultaneously metaphorical and precise, when Abraham submitted to Melchizedek and Apos, as priesthood, Levi submitted. The entire Levitical order, in its ancestor and Apos, ancestor, acknowledged that a greater priesthood existed, one it could not match, one it did not supersede, one it was always pointing toward. This was not a replacement of Aaron and Apos, priesthood so much as a revelation of what Aaron and Apos, priesthood was always for. It was always scaffolding. It was always temporary. It was always meant to hold the building until the building could hold itself. Let us go back to the valley. Let us go back to the man who walked out of the silence with bread and wine in his hands. You know more about him now than you did. You know his name means righteousness, and the city he rules means peace, and that sequence is a theology compressed into a greeting. You know a Canaanite in the age of Abram, before Israel, before Moses, before the law, already addressed the God of the universe by the same name Abraham used. You know that this figure haunted Jewish imagination for 1,500 years, that Josephus could not write about Jerusalem without mentioning him, that the Qumran community built an entire end-times theology around him, that David reached back across a millennium to invoke his name in the coronation of a king. And you know that when the question arose, how can a man from Judah be our high priest? The answer was already waiting in 3 verses of Genesis that most readers skip. Here is what I want you to see now. What it cost God to design this. The silence around Melchizedek is not the absence of information. It is the presence of a shape, a deliberate, architectural shape. The way a sculptor removes stone to reveal a figure, the text of Genesis removes biographical data to reveal something harder to see than a name. The outline of a priesthood that transcends time, transcends bloodline, transcends death. God had a portrait of the Messiah and Apos, priesthood inside a man and Apos, missing paperwork. He placed it in Genesis, the first book, the book of origins, and surrounded it with genealogies on every side so that the gap would be impossible to miss. So that every careful reader who got to chapter 14 and noticed that something was wrong, something was absent, something had been deliberately left out, would lean in, would ask the question, would chase the thread. And the thread leads here. To a high priest who ever lives to make intercession. Hebrews chapter 7, verse 25, the verse that closes the argument. He ever lives. Not he lived. Not he lives on in memory. He ever lives. Present tense. Active. Ongoing. An intercession that has not stopped since the morning of the resurrection and will not stop until the end of everything. This is not a story about an ancient king of Salem. This is a story about a priesthood that is still in operation right now. At this moment, as you hear these words, the throne room of heaven is not empty. The altar there is not unattended. There is a high priest who has carried your name into that room and has not left. But it gets stranger and more beautiful. The Levitical priests had to offer sacrifices for their own sins before they could offer sacrifices for the people. Every day of atonement, before the high priest could enter the Holy of Holies on behalf of Israel, he had to atone for himself. He was compromised, limited. Carrying his own weight of failure into a room, he entered to carry yours. Hebrews chapter 7, verse 26 calls Jesus a high priest who is holy, innocent, undefiled, separated from sinners, and exalted above the heavens. He did not need to deal with his own sin before handling yours. There was none. He walked into the greater Holy of Holies. Once, not annually. With blood that was not from a bull or a goat, but from his own veins, and the access that blood purchased was not valid for 1 year. It was permanent. This is what Melchizedek was pointing to, not with words, with his absence, with the 3 verses that told you almost nothing, and in doing so told you everything. The priest who comes with bread and wine, who blesses the battle-worn warrior, who takes the tithe without explanation because no explanation is needed, who disappears without dying, who exists in the text the way a great promise exists in the soul, complete, quiet, waiting to be understood. That priest was always a sketch, and the sketch was always waiting for its subject. So what do you do with this? 3 things. And the third one is the one that will stay with you. First, the silence in Scripture is not always a problem to solve. Sometimes it is an invitation to look more carefully. Every gap in the text that has ever made you uncomfortable, every why didn't and oppose. God explained this, and why is this so short, and why does this figure disappear without a conclusion? Those gaps are not evidence of careless editing. The people who compiled this text were obsessively careful. If something is missing, ask what the shape of its missing tells you. Because sometimes God hides his deepest portraits inside the outlines of what is not there. Second, the bloodline problem that seemed to disqualify Jesus from the priesthood was not a problem God failed to anticipate. It was a problem God designed in advance, precisely so that the answer would be unmistakable when it came. The Levitical system could not produce a permanent priest. It was never meant to. It was meant to make you ache for one. The ache was the point. And when Jesus arrived, from the wrong tribe, with the wrong genealogy for the job, the answer was already sitting in Genesis 14, in 3 verses, in the story of a king who walked out of the silence with bread and wine and then walked back into it. Third, and this is the one that matters most for where you are right now. You may be in a season of silence, a prayer that has not been answered the way you expected, a chapter of your life where God seems, to your senses, absent, where the altar feels unattended, where you have done everything you know to do and the ceiling still feels low. Hebrews does not offer you an explanation for those seasons. It offers you something better. It offers you a priest, a high priest who is not rotating through shifts, not passing his duties to a son when he dies, not limited by his own failure to access the room on your behalf. He is there now. He was there yesterday. He will be there in the silence of tomorrow. The writer of Hebrews is writing to people who are thinking about walking away, people under pressure, under persecution, under exhaustion. And his argument for why they should stay is not primarily a theological treatise, though it is that. His argument is this: you have a high priest unlike any high priest who has ever lived. He ever lives to make intercession for you. You are not praying into an empty room. You are not waited upon by a priest who has aged out of his service. You have, in the order of Melchizedek, not of Levi, not of Aaron, but of that older, deeper, bloodline-defying order, a priest whose life cannot be dissolved. And the God who embedded that promise in the silence around a Canaanite king in Genesis 14, centuries before anyone had language to name it, that God is not careless with silence. Not yours, either. If this thread has been useful to you, share it with someone who is walking through a quiet season. And if you want to go deeper into the typology of the Old Testament and how it points to Christ, there is more where this came from. We will keep following the thread. A man walked into a valley with bread and wine. He said nothing except a blessing. And then he was gone. And the world was never the same.